Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this public discourse webinar on marriage and the public good. My name is Jamie Boulding. I'm the Associate Director at the Witherspoon Institute here in Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm also a contributing editor for special projects at Public Discourse. So we are celebrating through this webinar today the launch of this book right here, the Witherspoon Institute's latest book, the second edition of Marriage and the Public Good, 10 Principles, which we published just a few months ago in October of last year. So allow me briefly to quote from page 1 of the book. This book is the second edition of Marriage and the Public Good, 10 Principles, the outcome of scholarly research directed by the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. It brings together scholarship from economics, history, law, philosophy, psychiatry, and sociology to show why marriage, understood in the traditional manner, that is, the durable, loving union of one husband and one wife, holds tremendous value for the public interest. So we will be discussing this book in this webinar today. I should say that you can buy the book. It's available to buy through the Canavox website and Canavox store. Canavox is an international marriage movement sponsored by the Witherspoon Institute. I know that we have many friends and associates from Canavox joining us following along the webinar today. And the book will also shortly be available to buy on Amazon. So please do check out the Witherspoon Institute's offerings on Amazon. We also recently excerpted, we ran a small extract from the book at Public Discourse a couple of months ago. You can find the link for that excerpt at the registration page for this webinar that you would have visited as you registered on Zoom. And you can also Google and find the essay on Public Discourse. If you Google Public Discourse and America's Way Forward on Marriage, you should pretty easily find that essay. I should also mention this year is the Witherspoon Institute's 20th anniversary. And we're proud of the fact that over the past 20 years now, since 2003, we've published a number of high impact books on a range of issues, not just on marriage and the family and sexuality, which we'll be discussing today, but also on philosophy and natural law, on religious liberty, and on business and free markets. So we're delighted to celebrate the latest book published by the Witherspoon Institute, the second edition of Marriage and the Public Good, 10 Principles. Now, I'm particularly delighted. Joining us today to discuss the book is Dr. Amy Hamilton. Dr. Amy Hamilton played a big part in contributing research, editing, and writing to this book. So she's a great person to discuss it with us and celebrate the book's launch with us today during this webinar. Dr. Hamilton is a research associate at the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin. So thank you very much for joining us today, Amy.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm honored to be here.
Well, let me say, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, thank you for joining us, Amy, and thank you for everyone joining us live here on Zoom. We're also being live streamed on Facebook, and shortly following the conclusion of this webinar, we will post a recording on YouTube. So if you know of anyone who wasn't able to join live and is interested in watching this, nevertheless, please check out the Witherspoon Institute's YouTube channel in the next day or two, and this webinar will be posted on YouTube. One thing I'd like to point out as Amy and I get into our conversation today in this webinar, if you're following us live on Zoom, please do feel free to submit questions. So you have the Zoom Q&A feature, which I'm sure by this point we're all familiar with. So those following along on Zoom, please do feel free to submit questions for Amy, and we will make sure that we provide a good amount of time, depending on the number of questions, a good amount of time at the end of our hour, and I will put as many of those questions to Amy as I can. So at any point, please feel free to type in and submit your questions through the Q&A feature here on Zoom. So Amy, my first question, just to help set the scene for people who may not be familiar with the book or who may be interested in it, but who haven't yet read it. So I mentioned that this is actually the second edition of Witherspoon's book on marriage and the public good. The first edition was published in 2008. Of course, many things have changed since then. This new edition, the second edition, published last year in 2022. So I wonder if you could help set the scene for the viewers and say a little bit about the background leading up to both the first edition and the second edition of this book, the kind of political context, political developments. Just set the scene for us and provide some of that context to get things going. Thank you.
Okay, I will. Thank you so much. And I would like to just quickly say it was a very generous attribution to introduce me and the webinar email as one of the authors of this document. So I want to just give credit that I did do the social science update, but this was completely handed, this beautiful first edition document to me, which was not, I had no part in. So I felt like I was joining a great project that had already done a great good. And so I am definitely one of the editors, but I'm so grateful for all the work that was received. And then it passed through a number of hands after I passed it on. So I'm grateful. I'm actually doing this live stream from the Austin Institute. They friends of the Witherspoon Institute, of course, and I'm grateful to Professor Mark Rigneris and actually work as a research associate for him. And so I'm just grateful for all, it was through Mark that this project came to me. So I too didn't know about the first edition until, of course, it was introduced to me. I certainly hadn't known of the Witherspoon Institute back in 2004 when this document actually started its nascent beginnings. So just to give you some background, which is really helpful, is just think about the first edition and the second edition just elaborates what we all know is that the marriage as an institution and as the bedrock founding of society, the family, so forth, had been really under assault and undergoing decades of deterioration and challenges. And so if you think about the introduction of no-fault divorce in California, that was 1969. And then 1975, most of all states had no-fault divorce by 1975. So that introduced this divorce revolution that was taking place. And then, fast forward 20 years and you're seeing that kind of damage from divorce. And then, of course, the rise in non-marital childbearing. But then 1995, there started to be discussion of same-sex marriage and legalization of that, which would, again, change the nature and the definition of legally of what marriage actually is. And so 1996, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act came into being. And so the federal recognition of the institution of marriage as being between one man and one woman. Well, in 2003, you had Massachusetts legalize same-sex marriage. 2004, the first same-sex marriage weddings began being performed in the state. And so it was in that kind of, if you look at that milieu and that political context leading up to, so 2004, the Witherspoon Institute, newly, inaugurated, I guess about 2 years old, they gathered a group of scholars, philosophers, sociologists, natural law, and let's talk about marriage. It's vitally important. This is crucial to our society, to the common good, to human flourishing. And so what can we contribute? What can we talk about? So that as they talked amongst themselves, they realized the insights and the wisdom and the science that they had would be a thing worthy of sharing. Because I think over the last decades, society was kind of losing a lot of its grounding in terms of why is this institution so important? It's actually undergoing massive changes, right? The permanence that was assumed that it was a lifelong union, or that if there was a divorce, this was something to really strive to be avoided, and it had to be based on a fault, right? One of the main 3 A's, that kind of thing. So that's the context of the first edition. And so, 2004 were the discussions and the compilations. And so then by 2008, it came out. 10 principles, 2008, and those 10 principles haven't changed, right? So now here we are, and 10 years later, 2018 is actually when the update for the second edition was started. So let's look at how the landscape had changed, right? We all know this. In 2010, I was shocked to learn this. In 2010, New York was actually the last state to allow no-fault divorce. 2012, we have a repeal of part of DOMA, right? where the U.S. versus Windsor, which was a dispute about, property and inheritance taxes and so forth between a couple that had been same-sex legally married in Canada. And then, of course, we have 2015 Obergefell and the same-sex marriage ruling. And so I think it's interesting that of course, the 2018 was started. It's like, can we update this to reiterate the good of marriage in a society that's continuing to lose the knowledge of that? And in fact, people who used to know it are growing forgetful, or feeling like maybe it's not as important of a thing to stand for, to try to strengthen again, because people's mores and society has changed and things have moved on. And so I just think it's very interesting that we finally managed to get the 2022 is the version, and it comes out right when the Respect for Marriage Act. So you have the complete reversal, the complete repeal of DOMA, and the replacement with the Respect for Marriage Act. So I think the timing is critical, and it's a much needed contribution to the conversation. But it's out of these things that the scholars and the Institute says we've got to inform society and continue to make the case based on reason and human flourishing and the common good from the social sciences. This is why this institution is unique and is foundational and is not optional.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. That's incredibly helpful, providing the context there, out of which the first edition in 2008 and now this new second edition in 2022 existed. You mentioned the 10 principles, and of course, the book's subtitle is 10 principles. So, if I may, I'll just read out the 10 principles just for the benefit of the audience, just to kind of give us a basis so that people understand, where we're coming from, where the book is coming from, the kind of foundation of the book. And as you say, the 10 principles haven't changed because, the fundamental nature of marriage is enduring. It doesn't change. On the other hand, there are some things that have changed and developed. You talked about the political developments. Social science continues to throw up new research findings. So perhaps we'll get onto that in a minute. But let me just articulate the 10 principles for the benefit of the viewers right now. So number 1, marriage is a personal union of husband and wife intended for mutual care throughout the whole of life. Number 2, marriage is a profound human good, elevating and perfecting our social and sexual nature. Number 3, ordinarily, both men and women who marry are better off as a result. Number 4, marriage protects and promotes the well-being of children. And I know that's a particularly important point that we'll get into in a few minutes, the well-being of children. Number 5, marriage sustains civil society and promotes the common good. Number 6, marriage is a wealth-creating institution, increasing human and social capital. Number 7, when marriage weakens, the equality gap widens. Number 8, a functional marriage culture fosters political liberty and reduces the burden on government programs. Number 9, laws governing marriage matter significantly. And number 10, civil marriage and religious marriage should not be isolated from one another. So those are the 10 principles that, as you say, have not changed from the first edition to the second edition. But one important part of the book that has changed and has been updated and developed significantly is the evidence from the sciences, right? The evidence from the social sciences. And I know that's something that you contributed to in this second edition. So, for example, this second edition has 250 citations. I think that's more than double the number that we saw in the first edition. So the social science findings have continued to come through and continue to bear upon this conversation. So just to begin thinking about the evidence from the sciences, I wonder, Amy, if we could think about the well-being of children. So let me just, again, briefly quote from the book on the well-being of children, and then perhaps you can say a little bit more for the viewers. So the book says that the evidence linking the health of marriage to the welfare of children is definitive. A large body of social scientific research has emerged in the past 4 decades, indicating that children do best when reared by their mothers and fathers in a married and intact family. So Amy, I wonder if you could speak more to the question of the well-being of children, perhaps touch on issues like shared biology and stability, having a greater sense of stability, and why is the well-being of children such a key aspect of the findings coming through from social science?
Well, of course, that's where we form our citizenry for the next generation, and that really is, the future of the nation. And so, children among, are the most vulnerable among us, and so we want what's best for them as a matter of justice, and love and care, but also as a matter of health for the future of the nation, right? And so when you're talking about so in all leading up to this dissolution and these attacks on marriage was ordering our procreation, right? I mean, it was giving an order and a stability to our sexual lives, which male and female is where the procreation happens. And so while there were non-marital pregnancies, right, they usually resolved in marriage before the sexual revolution and so forth. I mean, people certainly were having sex outside of marriage, not as much. And if pregnancies resulted, then marriages usually resulted. So there was just so much less of a context where a child would be a priori or suddenly separated from one of his biological parents. And so to state that the fact that children have a right to be raised, right, and that it's actually the best context for them to be raised by their biological parents, mother and father, it used to be a clear, that was just the way it was. That's the nature of things. And now there's been such a proliferation of different family structures and different sexual romantic arrangements between adults that you actually have to restate what really should be obvious, right? But it's no longer obvious. And when you look at the well-being of children, though, it is. And so I actually started the document with just the kind of this next best case scenario. So adoption of children in infancy to a stably married mother and father home. I myself am a child of adoption. So I was adopted as a 4-day-old infant, product of the sexual revolution. I was born in 1970. So in looking at that, you have adoptive parents are highly committed. They usually have more financial resources. They're usually more educated. They deeply love their child. And yet, if you look at the research, adoptees simply are likely to have more difficulties. And that's not a fault of the adoptive parents and has nothing to say about the quality of their parenting, but it is to say that children, this natural arrangement of emerging from the mother that birthed you and the genetics that created you with mother and father, that's the best case scenario. And so if you go one deviation away from that, like get the closest you can, where you have a stable mother and a father, so you've got sexual complementarity within the home, but you remove the genetic link, there's still a problem, even if they're adopted in infancy, right? And so with divorce, that obviously there's a loss of one of the biological parents, or at least there's a separation of shared time, a loss of time, a loss of influence, and so forth. But now there's such a push to make it seem like genetic links are not important. There's a kind of a rewriting of what children actually need because of our adult preferences and arrangements, right? And so, when we look at divorce, there's usually a lament that, oh, this child is going to lose one part of his, time with his parent, or he's going to have to split between two households. And now we have whole industries that are doing single fathers, or single mothers by choice, just get your gametes and create your child. And this is a right arrangement for you, never thinking about the genetic loss and the loss of one of those parents. So there was some, discussion about, why start with adoption? Well, I'm just trying to show that the best case scenario, and every standard deviation you go away from that, is it incurs more loss. And so, because what's of course so contentious and difficult in these days is, oh, well, people, you're saying that same-sex parents can't be good parents. Well, not saying that individual mothers and fathers can't be amazing individual mothers and fathers, but that household unit can never provide the child with one of his genetic parents. It entails the loss of one or both. And so apart from the genetic contribution, of course, but you have a mother and a father, even in adopted homes or just the natural intact gold standard, you have complementarity. Mothers and fathers are different. They're not interchangeable. They perform different functions. They interact with children differently. They contribute different things to their success. And so just trying to establish that in a context where kind of everything goes now. And we have to own the fact that we started this with, again, no fault divorce. We said kids are resilient. They're gonna be fine, and we can rearrange our lives as we see fit. And now it's just gone to such degrees that we have to restate once again, no, the evidence continues to come in. And that was the difficult part with the social sciences. It was, when do you stop? I mean, there's just so many studies. And the last of the studies, this, if you're looking for the update, these studies would end in 2018, but the evidence just continues to accumulate about the biological intact married family being the best possible scenario for the child. I love the research. I quoted a lot from a book by Paul Rayburn, Do Fathers Matter? And that research just continues to accumulate on the presence of a father in the home and how that affects children's physiology even.
Yeah, and one of the striking things from the section of the book that we're discussing now, that's summarizing the evidence from the social sciences, one of the striking things is that the book identifies 4 threats to marriage, or 4 challenges to marriage, and you've pretty much touched on all 4 of them already. So the 4 threats identified are divorce, which you've mentioned, non-marital births, cohabitation, and same-sex marriage, as you say, redefining the nature of marriage. So I don't know if you wanted to speak on any more of those 4 threats, or if we've covered that sufficiently already. If
do you have any specific questions?
Or on cohabitation, anything else come to mind?
I think what's interesting about cohabitation is it's the clearest mimicker of natural marriage, right? It mimics natural marriage, and yet it doesn't convey the same benefits, right? Even a child living with both its biological parents in a cohabiting union is actually they've found differences in scores in school, kindergarten scores, things like that. Cohabitation doesn't seem to convey all. It conveys some, right? They've got both their biological parents, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't convey the same level of benefits that marriage does. And of course, that child is much more likely to experience the breakup of that family unit than a child born to married parents, or I don't know the exact stats of if their parents marry after they have a child, but I think that would have a reduction effect on the instability of the union, right? No marriage at all. The cohabitation is the least likely for that child to make it to 18 with both of his parents still in the home.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned, Amy, so a lot of this research was completed, a few years back, and things continue to change so rapidly in the culture. So there are recent trends that kind of go beyond the scope of the book, or are not directly addressed in the book necessarily, that you and I have discussed previously. So, for example, the rise in support, in the culture in America, the rise in support for things like polygamy. Right, there was some Gallup research, I think, last year showing that acceptance levels of polygamy among the general population, among Americans, are now at their highest ever level. Something like nearly a quarter of Americans accept or are open to the idea of accepting of polygamy. We have, consensual non-monogamy increasing. We have polyamory becoming an issue in the culture. Yeah, I wonder, you had flagged some of these up in some of our previous discussions. I wonder if you could say a few words about some of these trends, and what do these trends say about where we are as a culture, where marriage culture is, why are they accelerating, and how do you think they'll develop? We'll get more onto the kind of forward-looking part of the book in a few minutes, but these trends specifically, how do you think about these recent trends?
Well, I think that shows, one of the things that it shows is just the diffusive effects of the law as a teacher. And so we've kind of, it's what we're imparting to the young through both our habits, right, our pairing habits and our relational rearrangements as adults, but also now the media and the law is now teaching that marriage no longer has the meaning that we all thought it once had, right? That it was male, female, it was for life, and it was potentially procreative, right? And it was this comprehensive union that was committed. And so if you can redefine those parameters, right? If you can say, well, marriage, it's for love, right? It's romantic arrangements. It's for personal satisfaction and personal happiness. I think if you can change one variable, you can change other variables, right? And so I think that it's just a diffusive effect throughout the culture of no longer understanding what marriage is versus other arrangements, and kind of the smorgasbord has been opened, right? Everything is a possibility. And when you can no longer articulate the reason for marriage, like that it's based on reason and the common good and human flourishing, it becomes very, very difficult to rein in any possible option out there. So like our only boundary line is consent, right? Anything like, so my marriage, I want it to be an open marriage. All it takes is the consent of two parties. They haven't opted into an institution where that's not an option, right? Yep. It's a permanent exclusive union between man and wife. And I think with Professor Regnerus, Mark Regnerus has done such a great job of looking at the data trends that have come out and the data that we have now on same-sex marriage. So this is just descriptive. This is not to denigrate. This is just to describe. So same-sex marriage, the data that we now have from sexual behavior surveys, the fidelity is simply not necessarily characteristic of a male-male marriage relationship, even if legally married. 21%, and this was from a couple survey in 2017, 21% of same-sex married male couples, 21% of those couples had reported having an extramarital partner. And that's a rate that's, 6 times higher than men that are married to women. Among those, that 21% that had extra partners, the average number of partners was 12. And so this is just a different type of relationship. This is a different type of structure, right? With female relationships, female, the stability that is presumed, again, that we're trying to restore, but still is there, right? With marriage, creating a strong tie that is not easy to break. They have 30% more instability. They have 2 to 3 times the number of breakups in those relationships. And so what is created is kind of 3 different types of arrangements, but by calling it all marriage, you're confusing
Yep.
matter to those that are growing up in this culture. Does that make sense? And so I think, again, that just the proliferation of options. I was looking at the data and realizing it's a tragedy, horrible tragedy. Any divorce that splits a child between two homes. But now you can have, and there is data and discussions from like Luke Gahan, an Australian scholar, researcher on same-sex couples. And so you have gay male couples that will partner with lesbian couples to create to a genetically related child to one of each of the partners, right? And then if those partners divorce, which lesbian couples have, 30% higher instability rate, if those partners divorce, I mean, they have the potential to be split between 4 homes, right? Or just to lose contact with one of the social parents if a split occurs. It's just a kind of a multiplication of possible harms, just from the nature of them not being in that unit to begin with, of the parents that created them. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much. And since we're about halfway through the webinar, I just want to thank everyone again who's joined us here live on Zoom. We have a great audience following us, and people have already been submitting questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. So thank you for those questions. Please continue to submit the questions, and we'll put them to Dr. Hamilton. Since we've been discussing the social science research aspect of the book, I'm going to put one of the audience questions to you, Amy, right now. So we have this question that came through, which I think is very interesting and important. So the question is, could Dr. Hamilton speak about the queering methodologies that I've heard about coming from some academics working in social science of the family? Is it true that there is a faction of social scientists who now claim that traditional research methods are oppressive and discriminatory, especially when the comparison group is the intact mother and father home? And if this faction is real, and if this viewpoint begins to take off, would that basically spell the end of the science in social science?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's not a new one in terms of the problem. That absolutely is an issue. The method of inquiry that has been used to determine comparisons between like same-sex configurations or households with children and so forth, that's always been an issue from the very, very beginning, because the claim was, well, we can't compare to the biological intact family. And so we're not going to use that as the comparison. Again, we're going to create a different comparison. Or each researcher has to acknowledge their, ideological commitments, biases, their worldview, and so forth. But it's disingenuous to say that we're not going to compare children to the possible male-female union that usually creates children. We're going to create a different comparison group, or we're going to. That's always been the issue, and so that's just it's further down the field. So in the I'm trying to keep this streamlined, but that's one of the recommendations that we added was about the suppression of research. So we can wait till we talk about that, but it's just for length, I guess it had to get edited out. But what you're dealing with, we're trying to restore an understanding of marriage as male-female and describe the benefits when we're in a situation in academia where even the reality of biological male and the reality of biological female as an ontological, physical, biological reality is now in question. And that kind of research can be suppressed. So I think the stakes are being upped in terms of really having to work to articulate the case and to realize that there really are, again, many factors and many sectors don't want to look at the data holistically because they don't want to see the evidence that is there. And I can say that as well for people who who don't want to acknowledge the effects of divorce, or who acknowledge the effects and just continue to say but the kids can just, be resilient. I mean, it's not to say that divorce is never, sometimes that has to happen, but the book talks about 2/3 of divorces with children are usually in low conflict marriages. And yet in the media, it's completely hyped and touted. I mean, you're unhappy, get out of there. So that's a problem. Yes, there is a querying methodologies. Yes, there's direct quotes. We can provide you with those. In fact, Mark Regnerus had a First Things piece several years ago called Queering Science, and there's some good quotes in there. It absolutely is happening. One things I was researching, and I just couldn't include everything, but I came across it was from the UK, and it was a treatise on same-sex parenting, and it was from a same-sex married mother, and she took the UN Convention, for the human rights and the rights of the child, and discussed the rights of a child to his or her parents, and simply inserted intended parents. Right? These are the legal parents. I mean, just that's a level of fiction there, where you just kind of write out reality. And yes, my child has a right to, her parents. That's me and my partner. But that there's a level of refusal to acknowledge, reality. Sometimes too, I think that just the snapshot of social science and the findings that we always have to contextualize it, right? So, as an adopted child, I am so grateful for my, wonderful family that I was adopted into, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a tragedy that, my mother experienced an unintended crisis pregnancy, that my father, abandoned her, and that there's not, you don't have to deny those things. And so I think sometimes you'll take a snapshot, and we look at like a synchronic slice in time. And so, unhappy marriages, divorce. Well, actually, there was a survey of couples that were close to divorce, and 5 years later, the ones that had stuck it out, 5 years later, they were very happy that they hadn't divorced. So you look at these the slice in time saying, oh, single people are happier than married people. Well, perhaps when you're exhausted with young kids and, someone else is traveling the world, perhaps that's true. But we're looking for a whole life perspective, right? A whole life and a whole fabric of society, kind of human flourishing perspective. And so taken all together, the meaning that comes from having children versus, choosing to just, there's many reasons why people would be single. There's nothing wrong with that, but that marriage is a great good to encourage them. It's great to travel and be free, but there's also goods that you can't imagine that we want to at least encourage you to think about. So I know that's very far afield from the queering methodologies in science, but I just think about the way science is presented, and in the media, there's many, many pieces on the fantastic single life and the miseries of marriage, or you're unhappy, get out of your marriage. I mean, it's just constant. And that also happens in the sciences as well, obviously. One example is, there someone sent in, there's a study about how children in the Netherlands of same-sex parents are doing better educationally than the children of intact married parents. So, is this evidence that that's actually a better arrangement? Well, you look at it, and those couples had double the income of the married couples. And so, you can, first of all, you can say, well, double the income can create a lot of educational advantages and help, with that outcome. But that is such an isolated variable when you're talking about the well-being and the future prospects of a child. Education is great, but they're much more likely to be an only child. There's lack of siblings. Why don't they do a study where they interview them all about the missing parent? So Katie Faust and her organization, Them Before Us, of course, Kena Bach, state leader. I mean, she's incredible on these things. So y'all are all probably very familiar. But I at one point, I just got to a point of frustration. Like, social science can only tell you this much. And just because I'm educationally okay doesn't mean that, the non-marital circumstances of my birth were the best and that everything was fine.
Well, we have, I should say we have so many very good questions coming through. So let me put a couple more audience Q&A questions to you, Amy, before we move on to the kind of final part of the book. So here's a question from Andrea, who's been watching, and it bears upon something you mentioned a few minutes ago. She says, why are lesbian partnerships or marriages less stable and perhaps more likely to divorce? I think you had mentioned something about that previously.
Well, I have, can I say causally why for each scenario? Of course not. But I think in general, and this is, I'm giving the wisdom that Mark Regnerus shares and writes on, that this is a compounding of biological sex and gender effects. Yep. So I think 80% of divorces, if I remember right, most of divorces, up to 80%, are initiated by women. So they have a lot higher demand for emotional satisfaction and requirements for their marital relationship. So if I'm wrong on the 80%, forgive me, but it's certainly the majority. And so it's about a concatenation and a compounding of those sex differences. I think that the reason you find instability among women and you find in what we would call infidelity among men is that you've got two men, right? And they're more prone to want sex outside of the relationship. There was years ago, there was a study that investigated committed male couples. This was before legalized marriage, but committed male couples, and after who had been together long term, and after a certain number of years, I think at least certainly 5, but maybe even 1, none of them were monogamous. And so the researchers redefined monogamy for gay male couples, saying it's an emotional kind of monogamy. So they settle into like an arrangement. I'm not saying there's not a commitment, but the male propensity towards wanting more sex is accommodated in those arrangements. Well, I think that's I'm giving you that because I think the parallel is true for same-sex relationships between women. You get together, 2 women yes, they have a committed relationship, but those standards and the emotional, standard is set pretty high. And just as the women are more likely to initiate, departures in male-female relationships because of those standards being not met, or the emotional satisfaction, I think that's why you find more instability. Right. That's, again, that's my, certainly what I would posit, and would agree with things that Mark and others have said.
Let me, I am aware of the fact that time is passing. I'll put one more of the audience questions to you before we move on to the kind of final call to action of the book, which is important. So here's a question from Aaron, who has been watching. And this is Aaron's kind of idea or proposal to you, and see what you think about this. He says, could a solution be to encourage people to seek traditional gender roles? So he says, if kids grow up seeing that husbands and wives have unique roles, then traditional marriage makes sense. But if a kid grows up seeing, mother go to the office while dad stays home with the babies, doesn't that kind of suggest that men and women are interchangeable? This is Aaron's position. What do you make of the idea of traditional gender roles, and how do they relate to marriage?
I thank you. I thank everyone for the questions. I appreciate that, Aaron. the fact that the man might stay home and the woman might work, I do not think will confuse children about the interchangeability of male and female. The mother and the father relationships are different. Their hormones interact with the children in a different way. I married late, very late. I married at 37. I'm very blessed to have two children. And if I had been, I'm trying to think, if I had been the one going to work instead of my husband, I still don't, this children, I believe, still would have come to me for most of their nurture. I mean, they know the one that can nurse them. They know the smell of the mother, especially as young ones. So I just think the reality of father and mother, work relationships, and who's in the home, who's out of the home, those things in our modern society can obviously be negotiated. But there is a reality to the differences between mothers and fathers that endures, and those children know. I see the question, and it's a good question, but actually there's research. Catherine Pacolic does excellent work, and I'm wondering, I think she and Joseph Price did a study in 2020, are mothers and fathers interchangeable? And they took three data sets, and they found that, again, that mothers spend more time with their children, doing more things and doing certain types of things than fathers do, no matter who the breadwinner is. If you look at, if women are actually allowed and free to choose, this is found actually across globally, the more free a woman is to choose, the more she chooses nurturing roles. So occupation choice can be very different. Again, we're glad that things are open, but when they're free to choose, women and men actually do choose different, on average, different types of occupations. And women choose more nurturing jobs, and fathers choose more protective type jobs. So I just think that I don't think you have to worry that an intact home with a functioning marriage, no matter how the exchange of work is played out, the kids know, and they're not interchangeable. I mean, that's what makes it the claim. Oh, well, you can, men and women, there's no difference. We provide unique things to children that cannot be gotten through two women or only one woman, and so forth. And all of that is detailed in the book, or points you to other resources to find that. So thank you for that question.
Great, thank you, Amy. In the final 10 minutes or so, I want to turn to the concluding chapter of the book, which is called America's Way Forward on Marriage. And this is the chapter that was partly excerpted on Public Discourse just a couple of months ago. So you can find the link in the Zoom registration page that you would have visited to register for this webinar. You can access the essay through there. And also, if you just Google Public Discourse and America's Way Forward on Marriage, you should find it pretty easily. So I encourage everybody to check that sample of the book out if you're interested in learning more about what we've been talking about. But again, let me briefly quote from this chapter, just to set the scene for the viewers who may not be familiar, to give you a sense of what the book is proposing, looking forward, how to strengthen and restore a marriage culture in America. And then I'll put that to Amy, and she can give us our kind of concluding thoughts on this forward-looking call to action. So the book says that creating a marriage culture is not just a job for the government. In numerous instances, in fact, the government has declared open hostility toward many who would seek to create a marriage culture. Nevertheless, families, religious communities, and civic institutions, along with intellectual, moral, and religious leaders, must dare to point the way. So we, the Witherspoon Institute, the authors of the book, we call upon our nation's leaders and our fellow citizens to support public policies that strengthen traditional marriage as a social institution. And that's the key kind of mission of the book. So to that end, the book calls for 8 actions in particular, 8 actions, 8 proposals toward strengthening marriage. So I'm just going to run through the 8. again, just to give the viewers a sense of what the book is arguing, and perhaps we can touch upon some of these, Amy, because I know that some of these are new and updated from the first edition of the book. So number one, maintain the legal distinction between married and cohabiting couples. Number two, investigate divorce law reforms. Number three, end marriage penalties for low-income Americans. Number four, protect and expand pro-child and pro-family tax code provisions. Number five, and perhaps we can speak about this, protect the interests of children against a powerful fertility industry, including banning all surrogacy, the book proposes. Number six, protect the freedom to live out and express belief in the uniqueness of traditional marriage without fear of government coercion and hostility. Number seven, protect the freedom to conduct scholarly inquiry into these issues. So that's the academic freedom issue that we've already touched upon. And number eight, try to restore the understanding of marriage as uniquely the union of one man and one woman in lifelong caretaking exclusivity. So there's a lot there, the 8 proposals. I should say that the book goes into more detail. I'm just giving you the high level items. The book elaborates and provides details and arguments for all 8 of these calls to action. So perhaps, Amy, you could say a little bit about the additions to this call to action, because I know it's changed from the first edition to the second edition. You know, what is kind of new and updated in the second edition, and perhaps also touch on the issue of surrogacy and the book's contemplation of restricting or banning surrogacy.
Right. Well, the original version, the first edition, had in there about protecting children from the fertility industry, to ban the use of anonymous sperm and egg donors, that children have a right to know their origins and their heritage, and their true parentage. And so that was great. But thanks to the work of Jennifer Lahl and the Center for Bioethics and Culture, and just my reading, I realized, you know, we really, if we're making a statement, we need to take a stand on surrogacy, which is exploiting the children that are created, but also the women that are used as, you know, the dehumanizing term gestational carriers, these surrogate mothers. And, you know, that's you know, it was in 2021 that, you know, New York legalized surrogacy. And you're talking about, I just happened to come across this, that egg donation market is set to exceed 6 billion by 2032. Is right now in 2022 is 3.1 billion. And so again, that shows this diffusion effect and kind of the compounding effects. When we make these changes, we get unwanted interest. And so the fact that the surrogacy arrangements put the health of egg donors at risk, put the health of the surrogates at risk, and of course the children at risk. And so I think we just had to take a stand on that. And we're not alone. I mean, there's entire countries that have banned it completely, or at least banned commercial surrogacy. And I think that's part of the education effort, right? Of like, these things are happening, and there's at such a dizzying pace that sometimes people don't think it all through, or we really don't have the full information of the harms that come, the physical harms. Like, how can we ask someone to, you know, risk their life to create a genetic child? And the interesting thing too, again, is the adult-centered perspective, right? That if an adult wants a genetically related child, then that's what the adult gets, regardless, you know, of you know, who is harmed. And so that was, I think, an important addition, and I'm grateful for the work of, again, the CBC and Jennifer Lahl. So we had 5 in the first edition, and then of course 3 were added. And part of that was protect academic freedom, you know, protect the ability to advocate for these ideas without being, you know, suppressed or marginalized. And it's very interesting because I just saw that in the UK, Penny Mordaunt, who was a House of Commons leader, has written a letter to the bishops of the Church of England, essentially pressuring them to advocating for. And Jamie, you're originally from London, so I'm sure you know. I mean, this is a government, the connection there, and in the letter it was, this is hurting and people are feeling like they're second-class citizens because they can't have their marriage in the church. And so there is this pressure that we need to be free from. And
I'm very familiar with that story, and the supposedly British quote unquote conservative party. It's very, very depressing. But this webinar is about you, not about me. So I'll keep my opinions to myself.
Yeah.
But I would say since we since we just have a few minutes left, one question I just want to make sure, the final question I think that we get in there, because some of the audience questions have also expressed this idea. So how do we defend traditional marriage against kind of unjust and unfair accusations of bigotry? Because we all know about the culture, we all know how many people out there react to these kind of arguments and receive these kind of arguments. So in terms of educating the young and advancing a positive, constructive agenda that younger people can get behind, or skeptical people can get behind, even against all of the odds against us in the culture, I wonder if you can say a bit more about that, how to frame and advance these issues, how to deal with that, and including the role of groups like Canavox, who we've been referencing, and where you can buy the book via their store. Right.
Well, that's what I wanted to reiterate. So you have what's going on in the UK, but in America, with the Respect for Marriage Act, we now have conjoined phrases. This Respect for Marriage Act protects interracial marriages and same-sex marriages. Yeah. And never have those been, of course, that was the arguments put forward in Obergefell and so forth, but now, it is on par, this act, as if to oppose same-sex marriage is the same as opposing interracial marriage. And so I think it is more important than ever to educate through the initiative of Canavox is amazing. Right. And so I think if you read this book, or you read further literature, what comes over and over again is that the truth is there. It's that we don't want to live in accordance to it, and that it is worth fighting for. I mean, this trend of diffusion, Andrew Cherlin in 2021 showed that there's a huge class divide. Right. And it's usually been an education divide. So college educated women were like 8 times less likely to have a non-marital birth than women that were not college educated. And now that has shifted. Now we're seeing a rise in non-marital births to college educated women. So again, that the young are losing that awareness. And these class divides are coming very, very clearly. I highly recommend Institute for Family Studies, Brad Wilcox, Wendy Wong, all that crew, of course. But they just put out 95% of upper income mothers are married. 76% of middle income are married. 35% of lower income moms are married. This is, if you care about, creating a greater equity in the nation, family structure is always a key component. It overcomes race, it overcomes education. I mean, it can overcome so many effects, and it has community effects. I mean, the more 2-parent households that were in a neighborhood would predict that neighborhood being lifted out of poverty, even for the kids around that neighborhood that weren't in 2-parent households. And so I just think that with the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act, people can be extremely demoralized. I know we have 1 minute left, but they can be extremely demoralized. Is the opera over? Has the fat lady sung? Has the ship sailed? All of those things. And what I want to say is it's worth fighting for. It's worth reiterating. It's worth teaching the young. And getting educated. This is not based on anything except a desire for the greatest good, for the greatest number of people, especially the citizens coming up. And that's what we should encourage, and that's what we should try to strengthen.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. On that encouraging note, I think that's a great point to draw this conversation to a close, since we've reached the hour point. I just want to thank you again, Amy. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton, so much for joining us for this webinar. Thank you for all of your work on the book, which I encourage everybody to buy. It's available at the Canavox store. Will soon be available on Amazon. The extract is available to read on Public Discourse. So please, everybody, check the book out if you found this webinar interesting. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us live on Zoom, live on Facebook. Thank you all so much for your support of Public Discourse and the work we do. Please continue to read the site, to check back for our daily content, for our webinars and other special features that will be coming down the line this year. So thank you all very much, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everyone. Bye.